As you saw, English literacy is very low, and the Japanese can be very shy sometimes about doing business with people if they don't feel like they can speak confidently and do the level of business that they'd like to do. So sort of cracking that is a good thing. It wouldn't be a bad idea to get somebody to work with to help you find an importer who does speak Japanese. It's a huge advantage. The nationwide consumption is stagnant at about 2 liters per capita per annum. Just when we think it's going to go above that level as a nation, then something comes up. And obviously, Japan's been hit very hard by the global financial crisis recently. And also, they've had the terrible tsunami earlier this year and the ensuing problems with the nuclear. Wine only accounts for about 2% of alcohol consumption in Japan. Beer is the most popular alcoholic beverage, followed in popularity by sake, their own rice wine, shochu, which is a spirit made from rice, happochu, which is a low malt form of beer that gets less tax on it than beer, and chuhai, which is shochu mixed with a sort of fizzy, fruit-flavored drink. About over 1/3 of the wine consumed in Japan is domestic wine, and getting your average Japanese consumer to understand what the difference is between drinking that sort of bottled bulk wine that's very cheap and that has been labeled as Japanese and understanding what real quality wine is. Of course, as I just mentioned, the unemployment situation and the lack of disposable income are dampening the market, and increased demand for cheaper wines. They've had a really tough time financially. And small homes, you've probably heard about the small homes in Tokyo, which have a limited space for wine storage, and third-party storage is very expensive in Tokyo. Space is at a premium, as it is in Hong Kong, and it can be very expensive to store wine. Okay, Singapore, my home now. We've got a population of 4.8 million people. It's a multicultural nation comprised of a number of ethnic groups. 75% are Chinese or of Chinese origin, 14% Malay, 9% Indians, and 2% Eurasians. 71% of the population speaks English, and it's really just domestic workers and a few taxi drivers or people who are working on construction who don't speak any English. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody, if you come to Singapore to visit, that doesn't speak English. This is a still wine market, 70% red, 30% white, and approximately 70% off-trade and 30% on-trade. Now, opportunities in Singapore. The World Bank has recently rated Singapore as the most business-friendly economy in the world. It is very easy to do business with Singapore. They're very welcoming of new businesses coming in. And also, what I didn't mention about Japan is it can be very difficult sometimes to do customs clearance, and the bureaucracy is unbelievable when you're importing wine. So they've got very low taxes, but it's very difficult sometimes to get wine imported, and you really need to work with an importer who's very experienced. Not so in Singapore. Just about anybody can get a license to import alcohol, and the bureaucracy and the paperwork is minimal. It's a relatively mature market. Interestingly, they're not so France-focused. The number one importing country in Singapore is actually Australia. Some of that has to do with proximity. Australia is very close to Singapore. There's a lot of cross-tourism that goes on. Singaporeans know Australian wines. They've probably been to visit the wine regions on holiday and come back with great memories and information, invaluable information that you can only get from going to visit a region. And they're really quite trusting of their own palates. They know what quality is, and they're quite happy to sort of make their own wines up without having a brand or a region to fall back on when they're wondering what quality is. It's increasingly seen as a hub, not so much for China or Hong Kong or even Japan, which is further away than Australia, but certainly for neighboring Southeast Asian countries. Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia are strong wine markets, but it is really difficult to get wine into them. A lot of people will come to Singapore, find an importer that also distributes to these other markets, Southeast Asian markets, and it works brilliantly as a hub. An estimated 40 to 60% of fine wine imports are re-exported to one of these countries. And that's from my own figures. I went through once and just emailed all of the importers in Singapore and asked them, and they told me what percentage they actually re-export. Singapore's first casinos were launched in 2010. Oops, there we go. This is the now iconic, even though it's not very old, Marina Bay Sands building. Incredible hotel and casino there now. Hugely successful. Everybody was biting their nails wondering how successful these casinos were going to be. They're very flash, a lot of money has been put into them, and a lot of money has been spent there now. A growing number of specialist storage facilities for wine that are relatively cheap. I'm very impressed with these. I've gone to visit 4 or 5 of the dedicated storage facilities for wine, and they are very good. The temperatures, the humidity, the attention to detail, and they're surprisingly inexpensive. So it's encouraging a lot of people to collect wine when they might not have a cellar in their home, although a lot of wealthy Singaporeans do have cellars in their home. But it's encouraging people to say, oh yeah, I can invest in wine myself. I can start collecting because it's a great storage facility here. And also the Singapore Tourism Board and the Economic Development Board are looking to invest in making a wine niche for Singapore. So there's lots of money that's being put about by the government nowadays to help promote Singapore as a wine destination. But the challenges are that we are only 140 kilometers north of the equator. So it's hot all year round. You cannot afford to not pay attention to having refrigerated lorries, using reefer containers. You have to be vigilant at every stop. More and more wineries are accepting of that now, and they really are pushing the importers to make absolutely sure that they have the complete supply chain covered from the time that the wine leaves the winery until it gets to the person's doorstep. It has to be kept in refrigerated conditions at all times. That has held the wine market back for a long time. Recently, though, people can drink with a lot more confidence because that supply chain has become a lot better. Now, here's the other one. Only 51% of the population drink any alcohol even once a year. We got no religious qualms, we got no, we're a very, very affluent society. So it's got nothing to do with any of that, but we're actually very conservative. And you rarely see people getting drunk in Singapore, except maybe on a Friday night, and that's usually the expat bankers. But in Tokyo, for example, by contrast, you frequently see people on any night of the week getting, fall on the ground drunk, businessmen, old businessmen, Japanese businessmen. It's seen as completely acceptable. As long as you're at work the next morning, at the time you should be there, nobody cares, and nobody talks about it. It's quite a contrast to Singapore, where drinking is not really seen as that cool. We do have a tax on wine as well that kind of reflects that. The Singapore government goes back and forth saying, are we going to get rid of our tax, aren't we? It's not very high tax compared to the neighboring Southeast Asian countries. We have a straight, more or less, $7 Singapore, a bottle, which varies very slightly according to the alcohol level. So fortified wines really sort of take a beating. But your normal bottle of wine, you pay about 7 Singapore. That really destroys the lower end of the market. Most people will trade up to a mid-range wine because they're getting more value for money. Don't rely on price to break into Asian wine markets. Lead with your premium leg. So leading with your cheapest wines has the effect of milk turned sour. Distance can also be a challenge. Look for ways to bring Chile closer to Asia. I told you about how Australia has been very, very successful, particularly because of the cross-wine tourism that you get. You can't really do that. It's kind of difficult. You could do, as Deborah said, do some bundling to try and get people over to Chile and visit the wine regions along with any number of your other wonderful things that you have going on in this country. But any way that you can bring Chile to life for people in Japan or Singapore is to be encouraged. On the back of that, logistics can be a major problem. Develop ways to facilitate, for example, groupage containers. Maybe even, the wines of Chile could do something. I know that when I was working in Japan, it was always a huge issue. How am I going to fill a container to get it to, particularly with premium wines, over to Japan? And, yep, that about rounds up. Thanks very much. Sorry it took so long.
Wines of Chile, the natural choice.